Alright, what's going on, guys? So, the day is finally here. We're about to start the T5 swap. I've got pretty much all the parts laid out here. Everything you've pretty much seen before. If you follow me on Instagram, you saw that I got the flywheel. And after that, I also showed that I got all the swap parts from Yoshi Fab. And I got my Clutch Masters clutch kit right here. All some nice stuff. 6-puck ceramic. Pretty fairly high-end stuff. Cross member, and I did not show yet the actual transmission itself. This is a back when Borg Warner still owned the T5. Borg Warner world-class T5. That's what they called the T5 when they kind of redesigned it, made it a little stronger, and started using a standardized design across Ford, Nissan, a lot of different other cars that used it. There are differences from model to model, though. This one is from an 1986 Ford Mustang GT, as well as the drive shaft from the same car. And it looks like actually it may have been redone at one point. I did notice some sealant that was used, and obviously this shifter. Sorry, a little loud out here. This shifter handles aftermarket, but this plate also. I know that the original ones look like this, but it looks like it may have been replaced at some point. I know the previous owner did replace a couple seals and stuff on there, as you can see, but this thing feels killer. The engagement's all nice and tight. There's no weird feeling to it at all. Not much to do there. One thing that I will have to do before I even get to put the car up on ramps or anything is the adapter kit itself has a few bits that replace some pieces on the transmission itself. So, we're going to have to start off there, namely the front piece here. This is the front bearing retainer plate, I believe it's called. And pretty much we're going to be using this piece right here. And this is going to replace this piece, but we might have to mess with some shims and such in there, and it's going to be some fun. Gonna have to borrow my roommate's dial indicator and start messing with that. Alright, got some lighting since it's getting a little dark here. And I'm not gonna lie, I don't totally know what I'm doing just yet. This is my first time doing this kind of thing, but D-Works sends detailed instructions and a very big note. If it's your first time, read the instructions. If you're using a kit, especially for something you're not familiar with, and it comes with their specific instructions, make sure you read them properly and carefully, because there could be a lot of little information in there that you may not have known. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started with this. Basically, first thing you do is start taking it apart. Alright, so I've got the front retainer off here, and in the instructions it does say be very careful not to disturb the input shaft. The input shaft is basically being held in mostly by this plate, and if you pull it out, you can see where the gears mesh in there. Basically the whole transmission has to be realigned, and you have to be very careful it doesn't move in or out. Side to side a little bit's okay, but you got to be very, very careful not to pull it out. That's one big thing when you're dealing with a transmission or some other part of the car that's fairly sensitive to clearances and alignments and such. Make sure you know what not to touch. A lot of transmissions will have bolts like it's actually on the other side, but some bolts and such that you are not supposed to take out. Otherwise, the gears will basically fall out on the inside of the transmission. So, like I said, always very, very important to read the instructions. And the next part is to remove the bearing race. Basically, what a race is the other half, where a bearing sits, essentially, and any shims that may be present. And this is one shim. I don't see any other shims on the inside here. I'll set these aside for now. And like I said, this is the race. And the race is kind of a conical machine piece of metal that sits on the other side of a bearing. This is the bearing itself, and it has all these rollers in it, and it sits up against the race here, just like this. Try not to bump anything around that shouldn't be, like I mentioned. And the T5 also uses usually some shims, and what the shim does is it sets what kind of end-to-end play the input shaft will have in the transmission, and there should be little to none basically, but with certain variances in manufacturing, even within specs, you're always going to have a little bit of difference here and there from part to part, and that's what these shims are for. Alright, so I've got the retainer in here, I've got the retainer with the bearing race in here and the shim that came in and did the measurements, and it basically seems like I will be able to just use the shim that was already in the transmission. And so the next step is going to be to basically install it. Alright, that's all on here looking pretty, and we also got the car up on ramps, and we'll be ready to pull the old trans in a minute here. Alright, so this is the Volvo M47 transmission, and it's a piece of junk, kinda, not gonna lie. The shifter linkage is known to be kinda wonky sometimes, and in general they like to split apart under high horsepower. The only thing we're gonna be using is the bell housing, the clutch cable, the clutch fork, and I believe that'll be about it. The stock Volvo 2-piece drive shaft will also go, and as far as I know my diff is still good, so we'll be using that obviously. And the center carrier bearing cross member here will also go, a little bit of weight savings. And as I showed previously, I have a Yoshifab trans cross member and mount for that as well, so everything will become a bit lighter, a little bit stiffer, and much stronger. Alright, bit of a mess here. Wasn't able to really film under there because it's just too tight, too many tools flying around. So we have the 2-piece drive shaft, the center carrier bearing cross member, and the transmission cross member out. Transmission's currently being held up by the jack there, as you can see, and we're going to start working on getting that out of there. Okay, so it's been a little bit hard to film. I do apologize. I know I'm not really showing all that much, but it's pretty dirty and greasy around this old transmission, and not a whole lot of room in a lot of these spaces to film. But basically got the shifter out, got the bell housing bolts loosened up, and mounts and everything are all off, so the trans is ready to come out. Alright, I wish I could have filmed that, but it was a little bit of a mess there. We got the transmission out. We have just a bare flywheel and clutch just chilling there. I'm going to inspect that in a second. And this thing is a sorry old piece of work. Yeah, pretty ugly. Pretty dirty. So, yeah, not using this again, but just taking a look at it. Doesn't look like anything is majorly wrong with it, just kind of leaking here and there. Alright, now I'm gonna maybe see if I have time to take the clutch and flywheel off, and then probably call it a night. Alright, so this is day 2 of the T5 swap. We pretty much got everything torn out last night, as you saw. Just that stock flywheel and clutch setup still sitting here, hanging out. There it is. And I know I wasn't able to show too much yesterday because, you know, it was pretty cramped. We had, you know, we were basically just trying to get it out. And today I'm going to work on showing a bit more. I was able to get a shift knob for the T5, and this thing is just feeling awesome. Cannot wait to have this in the car. Really excited about that. I also have speed sensor, which I'm using as a plug for now. In the future, I might actually use it. Maybe if I go to Megasquirt or something, if I need a vehicle speed sensor signal. And I also have a plug for the, I think it's called the neutral sensor, or it's not really a neutral safety switch that Ford calls it, but it's close enough. Got a plug for that. I do have to screw this in the rest of the way. And with that, the transmission is pretty much ready to go. Now I have the bell housing off of the Volvo M47 with the clutch fork taken off, and that's going to be pretty much the first step before getting, well, I might start with taking the old flywheel and clutch out, but then the next step will be prepping this with the adapter set, and then we'll start throwing it in there. And I should be able to use the GoPro today so I can get some more shots of me actually working on the car. But to start off, we got to get everything out, lined up, and ready to work. Alright, so I got all the tools out, I got all the new parts, some of the old parts I'm going to throw in the shed in a little bit. I'll have to clean up the bell housing a little bit at some point and start prepping it with the adapter. To start off though, I will, like I said, be taking a look under the car at the stock flywheel and clutch. Still have to come off. Roll myself in here. So, interestingly enough, something I haven't seen before is that Volvo used some Allen key headed bolts to hold the pressure plate in. Now, I do have a selection of impact sets. Hopefully one of these will fit. If not, maybe I can at least break them loose with an Allen key. Alright, I got all the bolts out, and I think with a bit of coaxing, there we go. Just a tap, pressure plate is off, and the clutch is off as well. Alright, and it doesn't look too bad. It looks like it wasn't maybe totally seating properly. The flywheel does look a little interesting. Pressure plate looks okay, just looks old. But the flywheel tells a slightly different story. You can see there does seem to be some heat marks here and maybe a slight bit of surface cracking. Not exactly what you want to see from a flywheel, but got the new STS Machining LH 2.4 converted flat flywheel ready to go in. Just got to zip this old one off and get it going. Alright, bolts are out with no issues, same with the clutch. Probably going to need some coaxing to come off of here. There we go. Whew, and that's a heavy sucker. So I've got both clutch and flywheel setups next to each other here so you can really see the difference. This is why they call it a flat versus dished or dog dish flywheel. This is the earlier style that's been modified by STS Machining to have reluctor wheel teeth for the crank sensor, just like the original Volvo one, or the original later LH 2.4 flywheel has. But the earlier flywheel is significantly smaller and lighter than the later ones. Alright, so a little bit scattered here. Had to run to the parts store for a few things. But it looks like we're set to go now. I just was able to put the poly trans mount on the transmission, had to finagle some hardware in there, but I got it figured out. And the next step is to pull the old pilot bearing. And this is kind of funny, but I don't have a pilot bearing puller, which usually would work kind of like a crank pulley puller. Basically it would go in inside the pilot bearing, hook on it, and you would screw it in as it pushes on the crank, and it would pull it out kind of like that, basically from the inside. But when you don't have one of those, there is a trick that uses a bolt of some kind, namely a bolt that will just fit the inner diameter of the pilot bearing. And anything from sawdust to breadcrumbs to good old chassis grease, which is what I'm using today. And wouldn't you know it, but the bolt that I'm actually using is, you may notice, has something extra on it. That is a helicoil, and this is actually one of the bolts that I tried to use to fix my Mustang when it had the stripped crank bolt. And I believe this is the bolt that I bought to replace it that didn't fit, but it just so happens with the used helicoil that I couldn't use on it, it just fits nice and snug in there. So this will be plenty for my purposes. Basically, I'm gonna pack the pilot bearing full of grease and then drive the bolt, in this case a bolt with a helicoil, into the middle, and it should push the grease up against the back of the hole, back out the sides behind the pilot bearing, and force it out. So here we go. Alright, it is taking a few tries here, but it is making progress. If you notice, it is starting to lift out, so hopefully just a few more tries here. Alright, and there it is. This method is pretty messy, and it can take a few tries like it took me, but as you can see, it does work eventually. Alright, now to clean this up and get the new pilot bearing in and get all the new stuff on. Alright, now for the part that really makes this all possible, the transmission adapter itself. Time to bolt it to the front of the transmission. And here we have the final product. Looks great, and now it's time to start on the bell housing. So the bell housing part's pretty simple. Basically, you use a piece of wood on the inside and you knock out the throwout bearing sleeve. I already broke it loose here. It actually looked like it was missing the circlet that we're supposed to have. And there's also a seal that goes in the back. And then you take the D-Works T5 adapting one. We'll go ahead and install it in here. And I'm actually going to use a hammer and the old sleeve to drive the new one in. Alright, nice and snug, and they also supply the O-ring that's going to sit in there. And that's pretty much it for the bell housing. And now it's time to mate the bell housing and transmission together. And it's pretty simple. One thing you do have to watch, you don't lose your throwout and everything, is the O-ring on the inside, that it doesn't move out of place. And line up with the correct set of holes. In this case, mine will be the counterclockwise set, and just bolt it up. Alright, check that, and my buddy Mason did remind me that I actually can install the bell housing first and then the transmission, so I'm actually going to unbolt the transmission from the adapter, install the bell housing with the adapter attached, and then get the transmission installed after that. Alright, there was a bit of a skip there. Basically, long story short, did get the transmission in and did get the drive shaft on, but there's an issue with the cross member. A lot of other issues, so that's why I wasn't able to film that bit, but it is very late right now and I'm very exhausted, so gonna have to call it a night for now.